The desert didn't whisper. It groaned. With every gust of wind came a low, mournful hum, as if the lawn itself remembered loss. Jo Ellen Grady had never feared the silence before, but this year it was different. Her well had dried up in June, and with July came the rattlesnakes and cracked skin on her palms. She rationed her water with a savagery she'd once judged in others. 1 tin mug in the morning, 1 before bed, and maybe a damp cloth pressed to her forehead if the heat stole her breath. She hadn't seen another soul in 8 days. Then came the dust plume. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, heat shimmering like ghosts on the horizon. But the shape didn't vanish. It grew, slower than a rider, too steady for cattle. When it resolved in how a man on foot slumped and staggering toward her land, something in her chest tightened. He was barefoot, shoes tied round his neck with twine, feet blistered and bleeding, shirt torn down one arm. The desert had already tried to claim him. His lips were cracked, and he moved like someone fighting gravity with the last of his pride. Jo Ellen gripped the jug she was filling at the rain barrel. There was barely enough left for her next 2 days. She stood still as the wind swirled dust around her boots, watching the stranger limp closer until he collapsed just shy of her fence post. She didn't run to him, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd learned painfully that not every man who fell in front of her needed saving. Some of them rose up meaner than when they dropped. Still, she approached with caution. The stranger groaned, rolled onto his back, and Jo Ellen saw his eyes flutter open, hazel, glazed with fever. "I'm not here to rob you," he rasped, his voice hoarse as dry rope. "Just water." She looked down at her jug. It was already half full. She knelt beside him, the sun beating on the back of her neck, and poured 2 capfuls into his mouth. His throat moved greedily. Then he reached up, not for her, but for the water, as if he couldn't bear to look at her kindness. Jo Ellen hesitated, then pressed the jug into his shaking hands. He drank with a slow reverence, eyes closed, as if she'd just handed him life itself. "Name's Cal," he muttered when he could speak again. "Jo," she said simply, scanning the horizon. "Grady Ranch? Not much left of it these days." His gaze flicked to the skeletal remains of a windmill and the parched earth behind her. "Still," he croaked, "you gave me your water." She didn't reply. Because if she admitted what she'd just done, given her last ration to a man she didn't know, in a land where survival meant selfishness, she might scream at herself, or laugh, or worse, hope. Instead, she helped him to the shade of the barn, rolled out a threadbare blanket, and left him with a tin cup and half a promise that she'd see how he felt in the morning. But that night, Jo Ellen couldn't sleep. The desert was too quiet again, and her thoughts too loud. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had something deep in her bones, something older than fear, told her that giving him that water wasn't just kindness. It had been necessary. By dawn, she'd made a decision. If the man survived, he could earn his keep. If he didn't, at least he hadn't died alone. But when she stepped outside, the spot beneath the barn eaves was empty. The blanket lay undisturbed. The cup was gone. So was the man. Except for one thing. A trail of gold dust, like pollen, shimmered in the dirt where he'd lain. Jo Ellen crouched over the trail of gold dust, disbelieving. She pinched a bit between her fingers and rubbed. It felt gritty, not like dirt, not like sand. It caught the light in a way nothing else in that sun-scorched patch of land had ever dared. She pressed it to her tongue, bitter, metallic, real, her breath caught in her chest. No one found gold here. This was cattle country, or had been once. Now it was drought, debt, and days without rain. But gold? She followed the trail. It wasn't long, maybe 20 feet. Just a shimmer where the man's boots had dragged. And at the end of it, under the broken slats of the fence, another glint. A nugget. A nugget, not dust. Jo Ellen stared. She knelt beside it, heart thundering in her chest. A dozen thoughts rushed in. Was this his? Had he dropped it? Was it a trick? A setup? She hadn't seen another person for weeks. But what if she wasn't alone anymore? She pocketed the nugget and backed away. Inside, she bolted the door, drew the curtains, and stared out through the gap in the timber, watching for movement. Nothing. Not even a buzzard. Just the wind. But her stomach twisted, because something was off. She'd seen that man on death's edge. He could barely walk, yet somehow he vanished without sound and left gold behind. It wasn't just strange. It was impossible. And then she saw it. Near the fence, in the same direction he'd vanished, a shape in the dirt. A small mound, freshly turned soil. Jo Ellen grabbed her shotgun. She hadn't touched it since the last coyote took one of her hens, but her hands remembered the weight. She stepped outside, boots crunching on gravel, the morning sun blinding in its intensity. At the mound, she found something wrapped in burlap. Small, deliberately buried. She dug it out, unwrapped it. Her hands began to shake. It was a satchel. Inside, more nuggets. A small leather pouch of coins, and a folded note. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. Jo didn't come here by accident. Was looking for someone good enough to leave this to. If you're reading this, I made it through the night, or I didn't. Either way, it's yours now. Dig at the place where I slept, calculating. She dropped to her knees. Her mind reeled. Who was he? Was he a thief, leaving behind stolen treasure? A miner on the run? Some kind of outlaw looking to die in peace? Or was he telling the truth? Jo Ellen ran back to the barn. Her breath came fast, shallow, not from exertion, but from the weight of what this could mean. She fetched the rusted spade from beside the water trough and thrust it into the ground where he'd lain. The soil was softer there. Too soft. 3 feet down, the blade struck something hard. She paused, dug carefully, then scraped back the dirt with her hands. A wooden crate. She pried it open. Gold, nuggets, dust, coins, even a ring. More than she'd ever seen in one place. More than most folks ever saw in a lifetime. Jo Ellen sat back in the dirt, her legs trembling. For years, she'd fought to hold this ranch together with spit, prayer, and old wire. She'd buried her father, her brothers, even her dreams. The world had offered her dust. Now it offered her this. But it wasn't just the gold. It was that someone, a stranger, had seen something in her worth trusting, worth choosing. She looked out over the dry field. The fence line was broken. The roof still leaked. The well was bone dry. But for the first time in years, Jo Ellen felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation bubbling up in her chest. Possibility and something else. The faintest trace of hope. It took Jo Ellen the better part of the day to haul the rest of the crate inside. Every trip back to the hole, every handful of dirt she brushed away, felt like unearthing a new chapter in a book she never thought she'd get to read. The weight of it, not just the gold, but the meaning behind it, settled into her bones like a long overdue rest. She sat at her kitchen table that night, the satchel open in front of her, the folded note beside a chipped coffee mug. The lantern cast a warm circle of light, flickering against the walls. She stared at the handwriting again. Was looking for someone good enough to leave this to. It wasn't just money, it was faith. Cal, whoever he truly was, had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself in years. Not since the drought came, not since the bank letters piled up, not since her mother's voice faded into silence one winter morning without warning. Jo Ellen had been surviving. But now, maybe, she could start living. The next morning she rode into town, not in rags, not on an old swayback mule. She wore her best blouse, brushed out her braid, and saddled her father's gelding, the one she'd nearly sold for feed. She didn't carry the satchel, just one nugget, enough to pay off the seed store and start a tab at the feed mill. The clerk did a double take. "Jo Ellen," he said, blinking. You all right?" She nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." He hesitated. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I did," she said with a soft smile. "Or maybe he just stopped by for a drink." She left town with more than supplies. She left with eyes following her, curious, questioning, maybe even a little hopeful. And the whispers started. "She's got a backer now. Must have come into something. About time someone recognized her grit." Jo Ellen didn't bother correcting them. Back on the ranch, she got to work. The roof was first, patched with fresh shingles. Then the barn doors, straightened and hung right. She paid Jonas, the town's only carpenter, to fix the sagging beams. The well? She had a driller come out. They found water, not much, but enough. And that land she thought was only good for dust? Turned out, once you scraped down far enough and gave it some care, it still remembered how to grow. In late spring, when the wildflowers came, so did people. A widow and her daughter from over the ridge. A former school teacher with arthritis who knew how to keep books. A boy who'd lost everything but still knew how to mend a fence and sing to cows at dawn. They didn't call it a ranch anymore. They called it Haven. By summer, Jo Ellen had something she never expected. A life that fed her, not just in crops but in company, in laughter, in letters from folks she barely knew thanking her for not giving up. And every time she looked at that crate of gold, now tucked safe beneath the floorboards, she whispered the same thing. "Thank you, Cal." She never saw him again. But once, just once, she found a horseshoe nailed to the gate, one that hadn't been there the day before. Shiny, untarnished. A sign? Maybe. Or maybe it was just the world's quiet way of saying, "You did good, girl." As the sun dipped below the ridge one evening, Jo Ellen stood with a cup of coffee and watched the light spill across the fields she'd once feared would bury her. Now they bloomed. She sipped, breathed in the peace, and smiled. Sometimes it's the smallest act of kindness, a drink of water, a shared silence, a choice to trust, that cracks the dry ground wide open and lets the gold rise.